It was the kind of betrayal that made silence heavier than shouting. I stood on the frozen sidewalk outside a dusty pawnshop window, staring at a thing that had no price, not to me at least. My mother's wedding dress, carefully folded on a faceless mannequin, its lace yellowed with age, was tagged with a number written in red ink. $250. That was all the clerk thought it was worth. I should have been surprised. I should have asked how did it end up here, but the truth had already gnawed its way into my bones. My brother, my own flesh and blood, he had pawned it, the one heirloom she had begged us both to protect. Sell it. It's just a rag now, he had once said, laughing with a mouthful of whiskey. At the time, I forced myself to believe he was joking. But staring at that window, I realized he'd spoken a promise. The dress had been stitched by hand decades before I was even born. My mother had told me how she'd saved for months, working as a seamstress, for neighbors cutting corners on her meals so she could afford the ivory fabric. She wore it when she married my father in the little stone chapel outside town. It was the only luxury she ever allowed herself. After he died, she kept it carefully wrapped in linen, telling us boys, "When I'm gone, this will be your memory of me. Protect it." I did. I stored it in cedar, carried it every time I moved, houses aired it in spring, checked the lace for moth damage. It wasn't just cloth, it was promise, sweat, love, and dignity woven into thread. My brother Malcolm never cared for such things. He lived for noise, money, the grand gesture. Where I was patient, he was reckless. Where I saved, he spent. And where I kept my silence, he filled the room with his voice. He liked to remind me that I was the quiet one, the one who'd never taken risks. Gregory, he'd sneer, "You'll leave the world the same way you came in, with nothing but old memories." But now here, he was selling those very memories for whiskey money. I walked into the shop, my boots crunching against the salt scattered on the floor. The clerk barely looked up from his ledger. "That dress in the window," I said softly. "Who brought it in?" He shrugged. "Guy in his 50s. Said it belonged to his late mother. He needed cash. Happens all the time." I didn't argue. I didn't reveal my name. I just nodded and left. Outside, the snow fell harder, stinging against my cheeks. I didn't buy it. No, not yet. Because this wasn't about $250. It was about a brother who had laughed in my face, who thought memory was disposable, who thought I was harmless. On the walk home, my hands clenched in my coat pockets. I remembered how things had started between us. We were children of a woman who believed in work before comfort. My mother mended clothes for the town always, with a straight spine and firm hands. My father ran a modest hardware store, one that smelled of sawdust and oil. I spent my teenage years stocking shelves and learning which nail fit which board. My brother, meanwhile, slipped out the back door to gamble at the pool hall. Still, when my father died, we both inherited that store. Malcolm convinced my mother to let him take over the books. He promised her he could grow it, make it bigger, expand into lumber and farm tools. She believed him, as mothers often do when one child shines brighter in charm while the other simply works. I didn't fight it. I ran errands, I balanced small accounts, I kept the store alive while he boasted about future profits. When creditors came knocking, it was me who sold my watch, me who stayed late to fix the books. My mother saw, but she never said much. Years later, when she grew ill, I was the one at her bedside each morning, sponging her forehead, reading to her, holding her hand when the morphine blurred her sight. Malcolm. He came once a week, dropping off flowers he'd bought on credit. Yet at the funeral he gave the speech. Loud, tearful, dramatic. People clapped him on the back while I stood silently by the casket. That was the shape of our life. He performed. I endured. So when I saw the dress in that window, I knew this was not an accident. It was a message. He had chosen to erase her memory and by extension erase me. The next week I visited his store, Malcolm's General Supply. A laughable name considering it was little more than a collection of borrowed loans, stacked shelves, and his inflated pride. He stood behind the counter, heavy in the middle, now thinning hair, combed carefully over his scalp, a gold chain glinting at his neck. "Well, well," he said, raising a brow. "If it isn't Gregory the Ghost. Haven't seen you around. What brings you here?" Looking for nails, I let my eyes wander the shelves, half-stocked some goods, gathering dust. His wife Linda gave me a curt nod from the back, carrying boxes that looked far too heavy for her. I saw the dress, I said simply. His smirk faltered for just a moment. Then he leaned back, laughing. "You mean that old rag, please. It was rotting in a box. Who needs it? No one but you, brother." My jaw clenched, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of anger. "Mother asked us to protect it," I said quietly. "She asked us to live Gregory. And I'm living. What good is lace to a man who can't pay bills? Besides, you wouldn't understand. You never risked anything in your life." He tapped the counter the way a man does when he thinks he's won. I looked at him, really looked. The sag beneath his eyes, the twitch in his jaw, the faint worry he tried to hide. His empire was cracking, though he'd never admit it. And suddenly the dress was no longer the battlefield. The battlefield was this very storefront. I walked out without another word. He called after me, chuckling, "Don't take it so hard, Gregory. You can't hold on to the past forever." But oh, how wrong he was. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of brandy and the old ledger books I'd kept from my father's time. I had records Malcolm thought forgotten, suppliers, contracts, deeds, and most importantly, the old loan agreements on the building he now claimed as his fortress. The dress had been pawned, but the store was next. I could almost hear my mother's voice as I traced the ink with my finger. Protect what matters. This wasn't rage. This wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate. I wouldn't storm into his life with fists. I would walk in with papers, contracts, locks. He thought I was sentimental. He thought I was weak. He thought pawning that dress had crushed me. But really, it had freed me. Because the man who laughs while selling his mother's memory doesn't deserve to keep the roof over his head. And I would be the one to take it. I did not sleep much that night. My mind was clear, sharper than it had been in years. I pictured the storefront with new locks, my name on the deed, and my brother's face when he realized he had been outplayed by the man he called a ghost. The dress in that window had been the insult. The store would be my answer. And I whispered into the dark so quiet even I could barely hear it. "You pawned her dress, Malcolm. I will buy your future." The morning after that vow, the air felt different. Cold, yes, January always was in our town, but sharper, almost metallic, as if the world itself wanted me awake. I poured myself coffee, black and bitter, and opened the old ledger again. The numbers were ghosts of my father's hand, but they were more alive than Malcolm's store would ever be. Every page reminded me of sacrifices we had made. The time my father sold half the farm tools at cost, just so old mister. Hendricks could plant in spring. The time he loaned nails to the church for repairs, never asking for a dime back. And the notes about the building itself. My father had bought it outright in the 1952nd, only to mortgage it later when the store was struggling. I remember those nights him staring at bills under the lamp, my mother ironing late into the night to keep us afloat. Malcolm didn't remember, or rather he refused to. He only remembered the applause when the store looked grand, when the shelves were full, when neighbors praised the family business. He never cared about the price paid in sweat. And now he had the nerve to pawn our mother's wedding dress, the last sacred piece of her. I wrote a list on yellow paper bank contacts, old suppliers, court records, tax filings. My handwriting shook a little at first, but steadied as the plan took shape. The next step was quiet observation. Revenge is like fishing. You don't thrash the water, you sit still and watch. So I watched. I walked by his storefront each day, pretending to glance at the weathered posters in the window. I noticed which deliveries arrived on time and which didn't. I saw the stock thinning the shelves, holding more dust than product. I overheard too. In a small town, whispers travel faster than mail. A farmer grumbled outside the diner about a late delivery of tools. A young mother muttered that the prices at Malcolm's store were higher than the chain store in the next town. And Linda, his wife, I saw her dragging boxes with no help, her face pale, her mouth thin with frustration. The empire was already fraying. My brother was patching it with swagger, pretending to be what he wasn't, and all the while I kept my silence. One evening I walked to the bank. The lobby smelled of varnished wood and old paper. Behind the counter sat Paul Jennings, the branch manager, a man my age with whom I'd gone to school. He recognized me at once. "Gregory Haldane," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Well, this is a surprise." I smiled faintly. "Paul, it's been a while." We talked for a while about the weather, about our children now scattered across the country, about the way the town had changed. Then, as if casually, I asked, "How's business for Malcolm these days?" Paul's smile thinned. He leaned back in his chair, lowering his voice. "Not great. He's over-leveraged. Too many loans, too much bravado. If he doesn't start paying down his debts, he may lose that storefront." I nodded slowly as though this were idle gossip. But inside, something tightened. "And if that happens," I asked softly. Paul glanced at me curious. "Well, the bank would have no choice but to foreclose. Put the property up for auction, but that's not for me to say. It all depends on the payments." I thanked him, shook his hand, and left. My heart was beating steady like a drum. The battlefield was in sight. That night I didn't drink brandy. I wanted my head clear. I sat at my desk and drew 2 columns, his weaknesses and my strengths. His weaknesses, too much debt, no savings, bad reputation with suppliers, pride bigger than sense, my strengths, my savings account untouched for years, records of his shady dealings, my patience, the town's memory of who I was, the quiet one but always fair. For the first time in decades, I felt the scales tipping my way. But revenge, if it is to be complete, needs witnesses. 2 weeks later, the town hosted its annual winter dinner, a potluck at the church hall, where everyone brought casseroles and gossip. I went wearing my best coat, my shoes polished. Malcolm was already there laughing too loudly, a drink in his hand. He clapped neighbors on the back telling stories about how business was booming. When he saw me, he grinned. "Gregory, you decided to crawl out of your cave." His voice carried across the room. Heads turned. I smiled thinly. "It's been a while." He leaned in close, his breath sour with beer. "Still sore about that dress, don't be." It was nothing, just fabric. "You can't build a life on memories, brother." I didn't flinch. I didn't answer. Instead, I looked him in the eye until his grin faltered. Then I turned and filled a plate with food, leaving him there unsettled. That silence spoke louder than any insult. The weeks passed and Malcolm's store grew thinner. Deliveries came late, then stopped altogether. His temper flared in public, yelling at Linda, snapping at customers. People noticed. They whispered, and I waited. Each evening, I walked past the pawn shop staring at the dress in the window. Sometimes I imagined buying it back, restoring it, keeping it safe. But no, not yet. To simply rescue it would be too easy. The lesson had to be deeper, because revenge is not about one item. It's about the soul of a man who thought himself untouchable. The breaking point came one icy February morning. I was in the diner when Malcolm stormed in, slamming a paper on the counter. "Can you believe this?" he shouted to anyone who would listen. "The bank wants payment by the end of the month. They're squeezing me." The room went quiet. Everyone glanced at each other. I sipped my coffee and kept my face neutral. Inside, though, I knew the clock had started. That evening, I visited Paul Jennings again. He closed the door to his office when I entered. "Gregory," he said carefully, "I can't share too much. But yes, the store's mortgage is at risk. Unless your brother finds money fast, it will go to auction. And if it does, I ask anyone can bid." Anyone, Paul confirmed. He hesitated. "You're thinking about it." I didn't deny it. I simply said, "Sometimes a man has to protect what should never have been pawned." Paul looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded slowly as if he understood more than I'd said. On my walk home, snow crunching underfoot, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. For once, I was not at the mercy of my brother's arrogance. He was at the mercy of his own mistakes. And I, the quiet one, the forgotten one, held the key to his undoing. The dress had been his insult. The store would be my answer. And so began the first true step of my revenge: silence, patience, and preparation. Because a man who pawns his mother's memory deserves to find his own future, sold to the highest bidder. And I would be there waiting with pen in hand. The first time I heard someone call my brother a sinking ship, I nearly smiled. Nearly. Because that was the exact phrase my father had once used to warn me about people who spent more than they earned, who talked more than they worked. Never tie your future to a sinking ship, Gregory. He told me back when I was a boy, sweeping sawdust off the floor of his hardware store, but Malcolm had built his whole life on leaks. And now, decades later, the waters were pouring in. I could see it all from the sidelines quietly, the way I always had. Linda came into the diner one morning ordering coffee with coins instead of bills. The supplier stopped extending credit, which meant the shelves at Malcolm's shop grew barer by the week. And the regulars, they drifted to the cheaper chain store in the next town. Loyalty lasts only as long as pride doesn't feel insulted. And Malcolm had insulted everyone eventually. Still, in public, he put on the same act. Laughing too loud, boasting about new shipments that never arrived. He looked like a man whistling on deck while the boat sank beneath him. I sat by the window in the diner, notebook open, pretending to write lists while my ears collected gossip. I heard it all: missed payments, rumors of loans, whispers that Linda had threatened to leave him. My pen traced idle lines across the paper, but what I was really sketching was his collapse. It would have been easy to gloat, to strut around reminding people that I had warned him. But gloating wasn't my weapon. Silence was. Because silence makes people wonder. Silence makes a fool nervous. And Malcolm hated nothing more than wondering what I was thinking. At night, I walked past the pawn shop window. The dress still hung there, yellow lace under the flickering fluorescent light. I imagined my mother standing beside me, watching her heirloom tagged with a cheap red number. I whispered to her, "Patience, mother. He will pay more dearly than money." Sometimes I thought of buying it back then and there, tucking it into a cedar chest once more. But no, the dress was bait, now a reminder of his betrayal every time I saw it. Until the store was mine, I would let it stay where it was a symbol of his decay. One Friday evening, Malcolm cornered me outside the church. Snow crunched under our boots as he jabbed a finger at my chest. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he hissed, his breath white in the cold air. I didn't answer. "You walk around like you've got the high ground, but you don't. You never risked a damn thing in your life, Gregory. You're just an old man clutching ghosts." His words were meant to cut, but they only confirmed what I already knew. He was scared. Fear makes men lash out. I looked at him, really looked, and I saw sweat on his temple, despite the cold, a tremor in his hand, though he tried to hold it steady. Finally, I said quietly, "The thing about ghosts, Malcolm, they don't go away." I turned and walked off, leaving him alone in the snow. My silence carried farther than his shouting ever could. Over the next weeks, I began moving my own pieces on the board. I visited old suppliers men who had worked with my father long before Malcolm swaggered into the business. I reminded them of the debts we'd once paid on time, the favors we'd done, the respect we'd shown. I didn't make promises. I simply let them know I was still here, still steady. I visited Paul at the bank again, sipping coffee in his office, while he hinted at the auction looming closer. And I started talking gently, quietly, to townsfolk. Not gossiping, no. Just planting small seeds. About responsibility. About memory. About the value of keeping one's word. They knew who I was and what my family had been. And by the time the auction came, I wanted them to know exactly which brother deserved the deed. Meanwhile, Malcolm spiraled. One afternoon, I passed the store and heard shouting inside. Linda's voice sharp with anger. "You pawned her dress. Malcolm, what else will you sell next? Our bed, our dignity." I paused outside but didn't enter. Some things are better left as echoes. That night, the dress was gone from the pawn shop window. My heart skipped until I asked the clerk. "Relax, old man," he said. "It's in the back. Your brother couldn't even keep up the pawn payment." And just like that, the insult deepened. Not only had he sold our mother's dress, he couldn't even afford to keep the pawn ticket. I walked home under the stars, my jaw tight, my resolve colder than the wind. The irony of it all struck me then. Malcolm had always mocked me for saving, for being careful, for holding on to what mattered. "You can't take it with you when you die, Greg," he'd roar. But I realized maybe you can't take it with you. Yet, you can decide who you leave it with. And I would make sure he left nothing. The sinking ship was nearly underwater. And when it finally went down, I would be there not to rescue him, but to claim what he had thrown away. Because silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the sound of the water rising. The first sign that Malcolm was truly cornered came in the form of a letter. Not to me, of course. He would never lower himself to ask his quiet brother for help, but to the town itself. He taped it on the front window of his store, scrawled in his thick handwriting. "Community sale. Everything must go." I read the words under the dim streetlight one evening. They weren't an invitation. They were a confession. A man doesn't sell everything unless he knows he won't own it for long. Inside, the shelves looked more desperate than stocked. A few shovels leaning against each other, bags of nails with dust on them, 2 lawnmowers that hadn't run in years. Linda was at the counter, her eyes tired, her smile forced. She didn't even greet me. Perhaps she knew I wasn't there to buy, I was there to watch. And watch I did. A farmer haggled him down on fertilizer. A young couple bought a hammer for half what it was worth. Malcolm, for all his pride, didn't argue. He needed the cash. Each sale was another crack in the hull. I left without saying a word. He didn't even notice me. At home, I lit a fire and sat with my brandy, the old ledger, spread on my lap. I traced the ink with my finger the way a man might trace the scars on his skin. Each number told a story of a bill paid, a favor honored, a memory kept intact. My father's hand was steady in those lines, unlike Malcolm's frantic scratches across his new accounts. And it struck me how history repeats itself. One son honors the other squanders, one keeps the other pawns. But this time, I would not let the squanderer win. The town grew more restless about Malcolm by the day. At the diner, voices dropped when his name was mentioned. "He owes me for feed," one man muttered. "Didn't pay me for the delivery," another whispered. People had been patient for years, mostly out of respect for our mother's memory. But patience wears thin when bills go unpaid. I never joined those conversations. I simply sipped my coffee, nodding now and then, letting their resentment simmer. Because a storm doesn't need help to form, just a quiet breeze to fan the clouds. One evening, Linda came to my door. She stood in the lamplight, wrapped in a wool coat, her face pale with exhaustion. "Gregory," she said softly, "he's drowning. And he won't admit it. I invited her in, poured her tea, and listened. He's borrowed from everyone, she confessed. He even tried to pawn my jewelry last week. The bank's letters keep coming and he tears them up before I can read them. I can't live like this. Her hands shook around the teacup. I studied her for a long moment. This was not a woman looking for rescue, she was looking for truth. Finally, I said, the bank will take the store soon. And when they do, you must decide whether you're going down with him or climbing into a different boat. Her eyes welled, but she nodded. She understood. When she left, I closed the door slowly, the echo of her footsteps fading into the snow. It wasn't pity, I felt it was clarity. Even his wife saw him for what he was now. The foreclosure notice came a week later. Malcolm tried to hide it, but in a small town, nothing stays hidden. People whispered about the auction date as though it were a funeral already scheduled. I visited Paul at the bank once more. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You're serious about bidding, aren't you?" he asked. "I'm serious," I said. He nodded slowly. "Then prepare yourself." He won't take it well. "I don't intend to tell him," I replied, my voice flat. "Not until it's done." Paul studied me, then gave a small smile. "I always knew you were the quiet one, Gregory." "Quiet doesn't mean weak, does it?" "No," I said. "It means patient." In the days that followed, Malcolm became frantic. I passed the store and saw him pacing behind the counter phone pressed to his ear, begging for credit, shouting at someone. He even tried to sell stock to the chain store in the next town. They laughed in his face. One afternoon, I stopped outside and looked through the glass. He noticed me slam the phone down and stormed to the door. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he snapped. Standing there waiting for me to fall? Well, newsflash, Gregory, I always land on my feet. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I only said, "A man who pawns his mother's dress has already fallen, Malcolm. The rest is just noise." His face flushed, red veins rising in his temple. For a second, I thought he might swing at me. But he didn't. He just slammed the door in my face. I walked away calm as the snow falling on my shoulders. His rage was confirmation. He knew the water was at his chin. The night before the auction, I walked past the pawn shop one last time. The dress was still there, shoved in the back, now half hidden behind a guitar and some broken china. Forgotten. Cheapened. But not by me. Never by me. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and whispered, "Tomorrow, mother. Tomorrow he pays." The pawn clerk eyed me from behind the counter, puzzled, but I didn't care. Some words aren't meant for clerks. That night, I slept better than I had in months. I dreamt of my father at the counter of his store, polishing a hammer, my mother folding laundry in the back. The store was alive again, clean, orderly, safe. When I woke, I realized it wasn't just a dream. It was a glimpse of what would soon be mine. Because in less than 24 hours, Malcolm's arrogance would meet its end. And my silence will finally speak louder than his laughter ever had. The morning of the auction, the church bells rang, as they always did, calling the faithful to prayer. But for me, they told for something else entirely, the end of my brother's reign of arrogance. I rose early, shaved carefully, and dressed in a dark wool suit that smelled faintly of cedar. I wanted no flamboyance, no spectacle, just dignity. The kind of dignity my father had carried every day of his life. When I stepped outside, the snow had turned to sleet tapping against my hat brim. The town was hushed as though holding its breath. People didn't often gather for an auction, but today was different. Everyone knew. Everyone wanted to see the fall of a man who had once called himself king of Main Street. Inside the bank's meeting hall, rows of wooden chairs faced a podium. Paul Jennings stood at the front shuffling papers, his glasses sliding down his nose. Neighbors filled the seats, whispering in low tones. I saw faces turn as I entered, nods, murmurs, even a few hands on my shoulder. No one said it aloud, but I knew what they were thinking. Gregory is here for a reason. Malcolm burst in 10 minutes late, coat flapping, face flushed. He scanned the room, saw me, and sneered. He tried to walk tall, but his eyes betrayed him, darting restless, calculating who might be his enemy. Linda trailed behind him, silent, her lips pressed tight. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. The auction began. Paul cleared his throat. Lot number 1, the property known as Malcolm's General Supply, including storefront fixtures and land parcel. Opening bid $20,000. The room fell quiet. Then a hand rose in the back, a farmer who owned 2 small shops on the edge of town. $20,000, he said firmly. Malcolm's face twisted. He hadn't expected competition so soon. He shot to his feet. $30,000, he barked. His voice cracked too loud for the room. I waited. Another hand lifted a businessman from the next county. 35. Malcolm's fist clenched. 40 gasps. Whispers. He didn't have that kind of money, and everyone knew it. But pride makes a man reckless. Finally, I raised my hand. My voice was calm, steady, 50. The room shifted. Heads turned. Even Paul looked up sharply. Malcolm spun toward me, his face redder than the auctioneer's gavel. You can't, you wouldn't dare. But I didn't look at him. I kept my gaze on Paul. Silence can be sharper than insult. 50,000 from Mr. Gregory Haldane, Paul announced. Do I hear 55? The farmer hesitated, then shook his head. The businessman frowned, scribbled something in his notebook, and lowered his hand. Going once, going twice. I could feel Malcolm trembling from across the room. His lips moved desperate for words, but no sound came. Linda closed her eyes. Sold, Paul said, his gavel striking wood. To Mr. Haldane. The room erupted in murmurs. For a moment, the silence between Malcolm and me was louder than the crowd. His chest rose and fell as though he'd run miles. Finally, he spat. You snake, you coward. You've been waiting for this day, haven't you? I stood buttoning my coat. No, Malcolm, I said softly. I've been waiting for you to dig your own grave. All I did was buy the headstone. The words cut deeper than shouting ever could. He lunged toward me, but Paul stepped between us, firm as a stone wall. Enough, Paul snapped. The deed is signed. The store is no longer yours. Malcolm's roar echoed through the hall, but it was hollow, the cry of a man stripped bare. I turned and walked out, the keys already heavy in my pocket. That afternoon, I unlocked the front door of the store. The hinges groaned, the smell of dust and neglect spilling out. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my shoes. This had once been my father's pride, my mother's lifeline, my own youth. Then Malcolm had poisoned it with debt and arrogance. Now it was mine again. I ran my hand along the counter, rough with scratches. Behind it, I imagined my father's steady posture, my mother's careful hands wrapping nails in brown paper for customers. For a moment, I felt tears sting my eyes. Not for Malcolm, he had earned his ruin, but for what had been lost and for what might be rebuilt. As I locked the door behind me, I heard footsteps. Linda stood at the curb, her coat pulled tight against the wind. You bought it, she whispered. Yes, I said. Her eyes darted toward the street where Malcolm paced like a madman, shouting at no one in particular. She lowered her voice. You know he'll never forgive you. I don't need his forgiveness, I replied. I need his silence. For the first time in years, her face softened. She nodded once, then walked away. That night, I poured myself a brandy and stared at the keys on my table. My mother's dress was still in the pawn shop, forgotten, gathering dust. But now I had something far greater than lace. I had taken back the ground, he'd stolen the roof, he'd disgraced. And I knew this was only the beginning, because locking him out was more than revenge. It was justice. It was memory restored. And I would savor it, sip by sip, like the brandy warming my throat. The day after the auction, the town was buzzing like a hive. News travels faster than fire when it's about someone falling, especially a man who once strutted through Main Street as if it belonged to him. Did you hear Gregory bought it? They say Malcolm nearly collapsed right there in the bank. About time that loudmouth got what was coming. I heard it all from the corner booth in the diner, nursing my coffee. I didn't correct them. I didn't gloat. I simply stirred sugar into the cup, letting the whispers roll past me. Silence was my armor, and today it fit better than ever. When I went to the store that afternoon, the front windows reflected more than just snow and sky. They reflected my father's face, stern and steady, as if reminding me that this ground had once been sacred. Inside the place was a skeleton. Bare shelves, scattered boxes, receipts crumpled on the floor. A broken chair lay on its side near the counter, a testament to Malcolm's tantrums. I picked it up, set it straight, and sat. For a long time, I just listened to the quiet. No shouting, no bragging, no lies. Just the groan of the old beams and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. It felt like home again, in its own way. Malcolm, however, did not take it quietly. He showed up the next morning, pounding on the door before I'd even turned the key. His face was red, his breath fogging in the cold. Open this door, he bellowed. This is my store. I stepped out from the shadows inside, holding the keys. Calmly, I slid one into the new lock, turned it with a click, and opened the door just wide enough for my voice. No, I said. His eyes widened. You snake. You backstabber. You've been plotting this for years. I shook my head. You pawned her dress, Malcolm. I didn't plot your fall. You built it. He lunged forward, trying to push his way in, but the new lock held firm. He slammed his fist against the glass, his face twisted with rage. You'll regret this, he spat. But I didn't flinch. I didn't shout back. I simply closed the door, turned the key, and left him pounding outside while I walked to the counter. The silence on my side of the glass was more powerful than any victory song. The town saw it all. Neighbors passing by, pausing on the sidewalk, whispering as Malcolm shouted like a madman at a locked door. For years, he'd humiliated me with sneers, public insults, mocking laughs. Now he was the spectacle and I was the quiet hand holding the keys. And oh, how silence can humiliate. In the days that followed, he kept trying. He came in the evenings shouting threats. He scribbled letters and taped them to the windows. I will take back what's mine. He even tried to rally sympathy at the tavern, painting me as the villain. But no one listened, because people remember. They remember the unpaid bills, the pawn dress, the arrogance, and they remembered me, the quiet brother who had stood by year after year, never asking for credit, never demanding the spotlight. The balance had shifted and the town had chosen. One evening, I unlocked the store and walked inside with a small wooden box. I placed it on the counter and opened the lid. Inside was the pawn ticket I had finally bought from the clerk that afternoon. The dress was safe in my cedar chest once more. I ran a hand over the box and whispered, "It's home, Mother. It's home." And yet I felt no urge to show Malcolm. That would have been too easy. He didn't deserve to know I'd rescued what he had thrown away. Some victories are best kept private, a secret between a son and his memory of his mother. Linda came by not long after, hesitant, as though afraid I might turn her away. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly. "Not for buying the store, though God knows someone had to, but for showing him the truth. He'll never admit it, but you've beaten him." I studied her face. She looked younger, somehow, freed of the constant weight of his lies. "Linda," I said quietly, "you don't owe me thanks. Just decide where you want to stand now, with him or with yourself." She nodded slowly, her eyes shining. "I've already decided." When she left, I felt no triumph, only confirmation. Even his wife had abandoned his sinking ship. One bitter evening, as the sun bled orange across the snow, I saw Malcolm standing on the corner across from the store. His shoulders slumped, his breath clouding the air. For the first time, he looked small. Not the booming, arrogant man who once mocked me, but just an aging fool who had wasted everything. He saw me through the window. Our eyes met. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. Then he turned away, his boots crunching off into the dark, leaving me alone with the store, my store. That night, I lit the lamps inside one by one until the place glowed with golden light. The shelves were still empty, the floor still dusty, but the bones were good. And I knew in time I would breathe life into it again, not as a monument to my brother's failure, but as a testament to my father's work, my mother's memory, and my own patience. I sat at the counter listening to the crackle of the lamps and thought, silence is not weakness. Silence is power waiting for its moment. And now, the moment was mine. Owning the store was never the finish line. It was only the first move in the long game. Revenge isn't about one decisive blow, it's about letting your opponent feel the weight of their loss day after day until it gnaws through their bones. And Malcolm, my brother, had plenty of bones left to strip. The day after the auction, I stood in the middle of the empty storefront. My father's counter was scratched, the shelves bare the air, thick with dust and neglect. I picked up a broom and began sweeping slowly the way I had as a boy. Every scrape of bristles against wood was like erasing a piece of Malcolm's arrogance. When the floor was clean, I didn't rush to fill it. I didn't rush to reopen. The emptiness itself was powerful. A clean locked room glowing with lamplight each evening was louder than any grand reopening. It whispered to the town, Gregory is in control now. And it whispered to Malcolm, you are locked out. The strategy was visibility. Each night I lit the lamps, polished the windows, and sat at the counter with a ledger, open pen in hand. People walking by saw me through the glass, steady, calm, untouchable. Some stopped, nodded, even pressed hands to the window with encouragement. And Malcolm. He walked by too. He pretended not to look, but his eyes always flickered toward the door, toward the keys he could no longer touch. His face twisted each time like a man smelling smoke in his own house but forbidden to douse the flames. In town, whispers multiplied. Gregory's got the store back. Looks better already. Maybe we'll see it thriving again. Malcolm heard those whispers. He sat in the diner some mornings, hands trembling as he stirred his coffee too long, face red as people talked just loud enough for him to hear. He'd bark at the waitress, slam coins on the counter, shout that I was a thief. But the louder he grew, the smaller he appeared. Because silence, when it holds, the deed drowns out shouting. I knew humiliation was only the first stage. To break him fully, I needed permanence. So I began planting seeds. I visited old suppliers, men who remembered my father's handshake deals, the debts I'd helped pay off in my youth. I reminded them quietly that if they wanted steadiness, I was here. I never mentioned Malcolm. I didn't have to. His name was already a sour taste on their tongues. I dropped quiet words with creditors to men he owed money to. I didn't need to encourage them, I simply told the truth. He no longer had property, the store was gone, he was exposed. And when truth does the talking, you don't need to raise your voice. Linda appeared at my door one gray morning. Her coat was buttoned wrong, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. "He's unraveling," she whispered, gripping her gloves in trembling hands. "He's drinking more. He blames me, blames you, blames the town. Last night he tried to sell the last of our furniture." I poured her tea, waited for her to steady. "You don't have to drown with him," I said quietly. She met my eyes, and for the first time she didn't defend him. She didn't beg me to be merciful. She only nodded slowly, as though she had already decided her path. When she left, I felt no triumph, only clarity. The sinking ship was shedding even its crew. Malcolm grew bolder in his desperation. One afternoon I was polishing the counter when his fist hammered against the door. His face was red, his voice hoarse. "Open this door, Gregory. This is mine, you hear me, mine." I walked calmly to the entrance, turned the new lock, and cracked the door just enough for him to see my eyes. "No," I said. He tried to shove it, but the lock held firm. "You snake," he spat. "You've been waiting for this all your life." "No," I corrected. "You pawned our mother's dress. I only bought what you abandoned." I closed the door, turned the key, and walked back to the counter. He pounded until his fists were raw, screaming insults that dissolved into the snow. I didn't move. I didn't answer. Silence was my victory. Neighbors passing on the street saw it all. They shook their heads, whispered, and kept walking. For years, he had humiliated me with public sneers. Now he was the spectacle, a fool raging at a lock. One evening, I visited the pawn shop. The dress still lingered there, shoved behind cracked guitars and chipped china, forgotten even by the clerk. I handed over cash for the ticket. He didn't care, just another dusty item off his shelf. When I carried the cedar box home and unfolded the yellowed lace, I felt my throat tighten. My mother's voice echoed, "Protect what matters." I placed the dress back in cedar safe again. But I didn't tell Malcolm. That would have been mercy. He would never know it was rescued. To him, it would remain lost, just as he had lost everything else. Some victories are best kept as private sanctuaries. The real theater was Main Street. I made sure of it. Each afternoon, I left the lamp's burning shelves empty, but glowing, the door locked with new iron. Townsfolk walked by, admiring how clean it looked, how dignified. And Malcolm was forced to pass by it daily, forced to see my calm silhouette at the counter ledger open, as though time had rewound to the days when our father had run things with order. He raged in taverns, accusing me of witchcraft, of betrayal, of plotting since childhood. His voice cracked. His audience dwindled. Even his drinking partners turned away. One night I stepped out of the store just as he staggered down the street shouting, "They'll never respect you, Gregory. They laugh at you behind your back." I walked calmly to him, close enough for only him to hear, and whispered, "No, Malcolm. They laugh at you. And now you're the only one who can't hear it." He froze. His mouth opened, but no words came. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time he looked truly old. I turned, locked the door behind me, and walked into the lighted store. His shadow lingered on the street, small and broken. That night I sat with the keys on the table and the cedar box upstairs. The store was mine. The dress was safe. The town has shifted. And yet I wasn't finished. Revenge is not just about taking. It's about erasing. Malcolm had pawned our mother's memory. I had bought his future. Now came the final act, ensuring he never again had a place in this town, not even as a ghost whispering in the corner. Because silence isn't weakness. Silence is the echo that replaces a man's name once he's gone. And I intended to make sure Malcolm's echo faded forever. The morning after I reclaimed the store, I awoke with the strange feeling that I had stepped into a life that wasn't mine, or perhaps one that had always been waiting for me. For decades, I had been the quiet brother, the one in the background, the one with a ledger instead of a voice. And now I held the keys. The silence that had once made me invisible now made me unmovable. But revenge, I reminded myself, is not finished with a single stroke. Owning the store was the hook. Now came the line and sinker. Malcolm had to drown not only in debt, but in the bitter knowledge that I had become, the very thing he mocked me for, never being powerful, respected, unavoidable. The auction had broken his pride, but pride is stubborn. He still swaggered about town, though his boots were scuffed, his coat threadbare, his wallet empty. He barked in the tavern, cursed in the street, and spun wild stories about how he'd rebuild bigger than ever. The more he shouted, the more people turned their faces away. I didn't need to silence him, the town was doing it for me. My role was simpler to ensure there was nowhere left for him to stand. I began with the suppliers. Quiet visits, handshakes, and small payments against debts long forgotten. For old times, I would say laying down crisp bills my father would have been proud of. The men smiled, their eyes soft with recognition. My father's son paying what my brother never could. The message spread: Gregory honors his word. Malcolm does not. Suppliers who once tolerated Malcolm's bluster stopped taking his calls. Some sent him curt letters demanding repayment. Others ignored him altogether. His name became a warning instead of a signature. Next came the creditors. I didn't prod them. I didn't need to. I only reminded them that the store was mine now, that Malcolm had no assets left. The truth did the work. Suddenly, old favors turned into demands, and his mailbox grew fat with bills he couldn't pay. I saw him one afternoon at the post office, tearing open envelopes, his face pale as he read. He looked up, saw me watching from across the street, and for a moment his fury burned. But then it flickered like a candle gasping in wind. He stuffed the letters into his coat and walked away, shoulders hunched. It was working. The man who once strutted now slouched. Meanwhile, I tended the store not by reopening it, but by preserving it. Lamps glowing each evening. Windows spotless. Floors swept. A monument not to commerce, but to endurance. People began to stop me in the street. "When will you reopen Gregory?" they'd ask. "The town needs you." I'd smile faintly. "Not yet," I'd reply, because keeping the door closed was the sharper blade. Each locked night reminded Malcolm that he hadn't just lost property, he'd lost legacy. Linda came often now, not to plead for him, but to sit quietly in the store with me. She'd bring bread, sometimes soup, and we'd eat at the counter. She spoke of leaving him, of starting anew. "He spends nights shouting at shadows," she whispered once. "Sometimes I think he shouts at your name. Sometimes at Mother's dress." She paused, then added, "He doesn't know you bought it back, does he?" "No," I said. "Good," she murmured. "Let him think it's gone. That's worse." Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in years I saw gratitude without bitterness. Malcolm's decline was not swift. Men like him fight their own drowning, thrashing, and spitting even as the water covers their mouths. He tried schemes of partnership with a distant cousin, a promise of new investors. He spread rumors that I cheated him, that I bribed the bank. But lies collapsed under their own weight. The cousin backed out. The investors laughed, and the rumors only made him sound desperate. One night, I heard him outside the store, pounding the door with both fists, screaming, "You can't erase me, Gregory, you can't. This town is mine." I didn't answer. I sat inside at the counter pen, scratching calmly across my ledger, the lamps casting my shadow against the walls. His voice cracked, grew hoarse, then fell silent. When I finally opened the door to look, he was gone, leaving only muddy footprints in the snow. But the final blow had to be public. It had to be something that left no doubt, not in his mind, not in the town's. The chance came in spring. The county fair was scheduled an event where everyone gathered, where speeches were made, deals struck, reputations built or broken. Malcolm, desperate, saw it as his stage. He arrived in a rumpled suit, hair slicked back with cheap oil, and mounted the platform. He raised his arms, calling for attention. "Friends," he shouted, "I know some of you think I've stumbled, but I'm here to tell you Malcolm Haldane is not finished. I've got investors. I've got plans, bigger and better than before." The crowd murmured. Some looked away. Others smirked. And then Paul Jennings, the bank manager, stepped forward. His voice was calm, deliberate. "That's a lie, Malcolm. You have no investors. You have no credit. You have nothing." Gasps rippled. Malcolm stammered, his face crimson. And then Paul turned to me, standing quietly in the crowd. "Gregory," he said loudly, "would you care to say a word?" I stepped forward, every eye on me. I let the silence hang until it felt heavy. Then I said softly, "My brother pawned our mother's wedding dress. I bought it back. He built his life on lies. I built mine on patience. In patience, I paused, looking directly at him, always outlives noise." The crowd erupted not with cheers, but with the murmurs of finality, the sound of reputations turning like soil in spring. Malcolm's face collapsed. He tried to shout, but no sound came. And I walked away, leaving him standing on the platform alone. That night, I lit the lamps in the store as usual. The shelves still empty, the door still locked. I poured a glass of brandy and set the keys on the counter. Through the window, I saw Malcolm across the street, staring at the store, his figure small under the lamplight. He stood there for a long time, then turned and disappeared into the dark. It was over. The store was mine. The dress was safe. The town had chosen. But revenge, I realized, wasn't about what I gained. It was about what he lost. And Malcolm had lost everything. Property, pride, wife, respect, and now the silence that once mocked me was his prison. The morning the letter arrived, the snow on my porch rail looked like folded linen. It made me think of the dress, my mother's careful hands, the needle slipping through ivory, the vow stitched into every seam, protect what matters. I set the kettle on the stove, slit the envelope with my thumbnail, and read the first line twice, though I'd been expecting it. District Court hearing notice. Petition for injunctive relief, trespass, harassment, nuisance, prospas harassment. Haldane versus Haldane. I placed the paper flat on the table and let the kettle sing. We kept a ledger of his pounding on the windows, his midnight threats, the notes taped to my door, the shouting that turned heads on Main Street. I hadn't raised my voice back. I hadn't threatened. I simply written. Quiet men look weak until someone reads what they've recorded. I folded the notice, slipped it into the inside pocket of my wool coat, and went to the store. Main Street was that slate gray of late winter, the color the sky wears when it's tired of pretending to be cheerful. I turned on the lamps and swept the floor, not because it needed sweeping, but because old stores prefer the sound of a broom to silence. Dust rose in little suns beneath the light, then settled as if they'd never been disturbed. Across the street, Malcolm stood with his collar turned up, hands shoved in his pockets. I don't think he slept much anymore. He watched me turn the key, watched me cross the floor, watched me lay my ledger on the counter as if the book were an altar. He didn't shout this time. He just stood there, his breath making small clouds he couldn't own. I propped the door for a minute to air the place. The bell gave that particular ring I've known since childhood, a sound like a polite throat clearing. He took a step toward the threshold. I looked at him. He stopped. He understood. The door closed. The hearing was set for a Tuesday. Paul Jennings walked me to the courtroom and patted my shoulder like a man steadying a fence post that had stood 70 years and didn't need steadying. Tell the truth, he said. Let the judge hear the quiet. The room smelled of varnish and cold paper. Malcolm sat at the far table in a borrowed suit that didn't fit a purple tie knotted like a bruise. He didn't look at me, not even when the clerk read our names. The judge was a woman in her 50s with iron gray hair and a face that didn't blink often. Mr. Haldane, she said, and we both could have answered. She looked at me. Gregory, you filed. Why? Because he pounded on the glass while I was inside counting bolts. Because he shouted threats that made the neighbor's daughter cry as she walked past. Because he taped a letter to my window that began, I'll make sure you choke on those keys. Because a man who pawned his mother's dress for whiskey money will pawn the piece of a whole street without blinking. I did not say any of that out loud. I opened the thin folder I'd prepared and slid copies across dates, times, photographs, witness statements, a log in my steady hand. I spoke brief sentences. I used the words trespass and harassment and interference with quiet enjoyment. I answered the judge's questions. I didn't look at Malcolm and I didn't try to hurt him with adjectives. Nouns were enough. Dates were enough. When it was his turn, he stood too fast and knocked his chair into the table. He's trying to erase me, he said, jabbing a finger in the air as if I were a fly that needed swatting. This town was mine before he stole it. He bought the bank. He bought the law. He's been plotting since we were kids. Evidence, the judge said. He gestured at the ceiling as if God might climb down with a receipt. Everyone knows names, she said. He said 3 names. 2 were dead. One sent a note to the court saying he'd moved to Florida last year and didn't want any part of this mess. The judge looked at our papers again. You've both grown men, she said. But only one of you has kept a ledger. She glanced over her glasses at me. Mr. Gregory Haldane, your petition is granted. Temporary injunction converted to permanent. The respondent is barred from entering the premises at 112 Main Street, from contacting petitioner directly or indirectly, from approaching within 50 yards of the property, and from any act calculated to alarm, threaten, or harass. Violation will be prosecuted. Her gavel tapped wood once, which is louder than shouting when you've been waiting for it. Malcolm froze, then laughed, that dry, empty laugh a man uses when no one joins him. Permanent, he said. You can't lock me out forever, but you can if forever is defined as the rest of your life. And courts prefer paper to swagger. We posted the order on the inside of the glass. Case number, a line of law, the judge's name in neat type. I didn't add anything extra. The words were plain, they did the work. Within hours, everyone knew. People paused at the window, read, nodded, and moved on. A lock is practical. An injunction is air everywhere at once. It travels faster than the man it's made for. That evening, I took a small brass plate from my coat pocket and screwed it into the oak beam above the counter. Haldane Mercantile. Est 1954. Reconstituted 2025. Underneath a second line in smaller type, not for sale. Then after the lamps warmed the room to honey, I lifted the cedar lid. The dress lay folded the way it had been in my mother's chest ivory gone to candlelight lace, softened by years of careful sleeping. I set the shadow box on the counter, arranged the fabric without drama, and sealed the glass. A simple brass tag, Eleanor Haldane's wedding dress, 1952, not for sale. I hung it behind the counter where it could be seen from the door, from the sidewalk, from across the street, if a man were to stand there for a long time and stare. I did not invite a crowd. I did not make a speech. I unlocked the door to the empty store, the bell rang, and the dress kept its own vigil. Word moves with a rhythm in a town like ours, a ripple at the diner, a murmur at the post office, a longer telling at the barber where men have to sit still long enough to listen. By Friday, people came one by one to stand in the doorway and look. Not at me, not at the shelves, still empty, but at the glass and the thread behind it. Mrs. Pritchard, who used to buy roofing nails for my father 1 pound at a time, touched the doorframe like a pew. She would have liked this, she whispered. The not for sale part most of all. I nodded. We stood in the warm light and listened to the old clock tick. Across the street, Malcolm hovered at the edge of the 50-yard line as if there were chalk on the road only he could see. He stared at the dress the way a thirsty man studies rain behind glass. The injunction held him the way a hand on the scruff holds a dog from lunging. For once, the law was not a threat but a fence that kept peace inside. Linda came on a Sunday with a cardboard box and a quiet face. She set the box on the counter, looked at the dress, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I signed the paper, she said. Separation. I'll file for divorce when the waiting period's done. I'm sorry, I said. She shook her head. I'm not. She opened the box. Inside were photographs, old receipts, a brass cash drawer handle with our father's thumb-worn shine. He was going to throw them in the bin, she said. Said, the past is dead. She looked up at the shadow box. It's not dead, she said. It only sleeps where someone keeps it warm. We set the cash drawer handle in a shallow frame beneath the dress with a small card. Cash drawer pull 1954, 1978. Not for sale. Linda smiled, kissed my cheek like a sister would, and left without looking to either side as she crossed the street. Some exiles start quietly. A suitcase and a gate you lock behind you once with no ceremony. I reopened in April on a Tuesday with a chalkboard that said, open when the bell rings and you see the light closed when you don't. No balloons, no newspaper ad. I'd spent weeks cleaning, ordering only what a town lives on, nails, screws, oil for hinges that complain when winter ends, a new generation of line levels, the kind of twine that ties up tomato vines without cutting them. Men came because the door was open, and because the counter was the same, and because my prices were fair. Women came because I wrapped what they bought in brown paper and tied it with the good string. Kids came for the bell and the way it always rang, once more as if the store liked being thanked. Sometimes a customer would glance up and see the dress and go quiet for a beat. Then they'd find their words again and ask whether a number 8 screw would hold a wobbly kitchen chair. I'd measure their palm against the box and say, this one's the friend you want. Dignity prefers errands to applause. Once late in the afternoon, the door shadowed. The bell rang and didn't ring because the door didn't open. 30 yards out beyond the injunction's invisible fence, Malcolm stood with his hands jammed into his pockets and a look on his face I had never seen before. Not anger, not even hate, just the gray knowledge that a door he'd pounded on would never open again, not in any of the ways that mattered. He stood there a long time with the April wind tugging at his coat. I did not move the way one does not move when a deer steps onto the road and you wanted to choose the trees. At length he turned away and kept walking, head down, a man who learned there are locks you cannot break, not because they're strong, but because someone stronger than you has decided they won't ever need to be opened. The town made room around him the way water closes after a boat's wake fades. Men nodded curtly, women looked past. The tavern learned to prefer customers who paid. He moved to a rental on the far edge of town, a 2-room place with blinds that stayed shut even at noon. Sometimes I'd see him walking the long way to the grocery so he wouldn't have to pass Main Street. Pride is not a compass. It's a blindfold. I didn't buy his house. I didn't call in a loan. I didn't own. I refuse the cruelty that's eager to keep going once it knows it can. Revenge should be exact, not endless. The point was never to ruin him. The point was to remove him from the place he'd claimed first, the counter, then the street, and finally the story. On Sundays, I'd unlock the store and sit at the counter with the lamps lit even though I wasn't open. Winter has a tale, lightning has thunder. Victory has its quiet. Sometimes I wrote letters I didn't mail. To my father, I kept the drawer handle where your thumb knew it. To my mother, I stopped the selling. He can't come past the glass. Your dress rests where the store keeps watch. If you've been poor or nearly so, or proud in the polite way that doesn't hold its hand out, you know there are words you say to the dead because they kept you alive long enough to need to say them. Summer came on, like a confession, reluctant, then all at once. The door stuck the way wooden doors do when the air fattens. I planed the edge, as my father had taught me, a little at a time. Listen for the change in the sound stop before you've taken more than the door wanted to give. People think fixing is just doing the thing. It's mostly listening to what the thing will allow. We had a town day, a sidewalk market, kids with lemonade, the volunteer firemen grilling sausages on a borrowed drum. The barber put 2 chairs outside and cut hair without the mirror, so men could watch the street instead of themselves. I moved the plank table to the threshold and set out jars of nails the way grocers set out peaches. A boy of 12 stopped and stared at the dress with that shy rudeness children haven't learned to apologize for. "Why does it say not for sale?" he asked. "Because some things aren't money," I said. "They're a promise." He looked at me as if I'd told him where a secret path in a field began. He nodded once, solemn, bought a yard of twine he didn't need, and left swinging the paper bag like a bell. Toward evening, as the light went copper on brick, Linda returned with a loaf wrapped in cloth. "I got a little place near the harbor," she said. "Smells like rope and pilings. It's good." She glanced across the crowd and then back to me. "He's gone to his sister's for a while. They say the air will do him good." "Where there are no stores to pass," I said. She didn't smile exactly, but her eyes softened. "Exactly there." We ate bread with salted butter at the counter and listened to the bell ring for other people. I sent her home with a jar of screws and a brush for the door trim. Sometimes a woman needs hardware more than flowers. Autumn has a way of telling truth that summer paints over. The tourists go home, the heat leaves, the leaves fall, and the backs of things show. I put away the sidewalk jars and stocked winter salt snow shovels with handles that won't splinter oil for the men who wait too long to treat their locks. One afternoon, I heard a sound outside that was not wind or a car or the little laugh the bell makes when a child leaves it ringing on purpose. It was a shoe scuff against pavement that I've heard my whole life. I looked up. There, 20 steps beyond the line the injunction drew, stood my brother in a coat too big for him. He looked smaller without the noise. Hunger trims a man in ways dieting never could. He kept his hands out where the police would want to see them if any were watching, which is how you know a man has learned the law the hard way. "Greg," he said. His voice did not carry like it used to. I didn't answer. Not because I refused, but because I wanted the first thing spoken in months to settle right. He swallowed. He looked at the sign, at the dress, at the counter, at everything he had never understood. "I can't come in." "No," I said. He nodded like a student repeating a lesson. "I pawned it," he said, as if I might not have known. "I pawned a lot of things." "Yes." He looked at the ground. "I thought it was just cloth." He lifted his head. There were 40 years of mistakes in his eyes, busy as ants. It wasn't number. He waited for me to use the moment like a hammer. I let it be a level instead. "Do you need anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "A number." He looked beyond me into the spill of lamplight, the yellow, the old wood, the calm. I just wanted to see. He swallowed again. I wanted to know if it was safe. "It is," I said. A sound came from him, not quite a sob and not a laugh. "Good," he said. He took a step back away, not forward, and that's when I knew he had learned something I couldn't teach him with any lock. He turned, lifted a hand in a clumsy half-wave that was more boy than man, and walked down the block toward the harbor where the air does better what sermons try to. I stood in the doorway with my hand on the jamb until he was gone. Not every enemy dies. Some live long enough to become a man you pray does not freeze in February. The first snow came early, the next year wet and heavy. I opened late, swept the stoop, salted the steps. The bell gave its winter ring lower as if the cold had put a coat on it. A woman came in for a shovel, a man for a hinge, a kid for a small hammer he swore was for projects, which I suspected meant dangerous experiments. I silently blessed anyway. I made coffee on the little hot plate behind the counter and poured 2 cups. One for me, one I set beneath the dress for nobody. You keep altars how you need to. The door opened and Paul stuck his head in. "Thought you might like some news," he said. "The judge who signed your injunction retired. New one reviewed permanent orders and extended a few, including yours, on her own motion. Administrative housekeeping. Extended 10 more years, he said. Not that you needed them. He nodded at the dress, at the sign, at the quiet, but paper likes to feel useful. After he left, I took down the injunction to replace the yellowed copy with the new. The type was the same. The words were the same. The forever moved further into the calendar, which is how forever works when you're lucky enough to live long. I cleaned the glass. A man takes care of what the law takes care of for him. On the anniversary of reopening, I wrote a notice for the window in my careful block letters. This place stands for the work that keeps a town upright, mending, measuring, fastening, remembering. If you're here for all that, come in. If you're here to sell what should be kept, keep walking. Below it in smaller letters, I added, not for sale. People smiled as they read. A few took pictures. A teenager rolled his eyes, and then the next day came back to buy a level for a shed he hadn't built yet. You plant seeds in rules, you harvest in habits. Sometimes late, I sit with the lamps dimmed to the edge of dark and hold the keys the way men hold rosaries. You can measure a life by the things you've locked and unlocked, doors, drawers, your own mouth when speaking would be a mistake. I have learned to turn a key like a prayer, steady exact with a patience that outlives tempers. I don't know what becomes of a man like my brother in the long run. Maybe he learns to sit in small rooms without shouting. Maybe he takes work where work is quiet. Maybe he does the math at last and sees that the sum of a life is not applause, but the absence of people closing their blinds when you walk by. Once in late spring, I saw him from a distance near the bus station. He had a small suitcase and a coat that fit better. He didn't see me. He boarded, found a seat by the window, and looked not at the town he was leaving, but at the hand he'd set on the seat beside him, as if to make sure it stayed. The bus pulled away. No one waved. It is a kind of mercy to leave without witnesses. The dress hangs where it should. The store breathes like a creature. The bell rings, the door closes, the hinge learns to be quiet with oil. The ledger fills in my patient hand, not with debts and bragging, but with simple entries that have weight and no drama. Sold £4, number 8 screws cash. Replace hinge on back door. Mended handle misses, preterred no charge. On the day the sun slants just so the glass of the shadow box throws a long, thin bar of light across the floor, past the counter to the threshold. It stops exactly where a man would stand if he wanted to enter and knew he couldn't. I don't know what lesson that island. I only know it happens, and I notice and I sweep around the light instead of through it. I am not a saint. I have enjoyed the clicks of the lock. I have savored the way the town's voice lowered when it learned to respect silence. I have found that revenge done properly becomes indistinguishable from order. A thing is in its place, and the wrong hands are kept away. At closing, I switch off the lamps one by one. The bell says its last good night. I walk to the door and look out at the street that's mine, not because I own it, but because I keep it. Then I turn the key. It is not the sound of a jail being shut. It is the sound of an oath being kept. Never underestimate the old.